All right, perfect. Then I'm gonna start off with a very simple question, really. What is democracy? Okay. Any ideas? So, um, oh, don't be shy. Anyone? Anyone? What is a democracy? What should they have in a democracy? No?
Well, maybe elections, maybe having the people
Yeah.
participate.
Yeah, exactly. So democracy means the rule of the people, right? Exactly like you said. And you have some kind of election to decide. Yeah. So it's the rule of the people. But then who are the people? What do they rule over? And how do they rule over it? You know, it's like only the definition of the word democracy, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. Um, so the political scientist Robert Dahl, he's a very, very famous political scientist. He proposed that democracy is made up of 5 components. So one is a political equality for the people. That means, you know, one vote per voter, essentially. Back in the day in Sweden, for example, you know, you could have your votes based on your fortune, based on the amount of money you had. If you didn't have enough money or property, you wouldn't be allowed to vote. The second component of democracy is effective partaking by the people, so that, you know, in the ideal of democracy, it's more democratic if you know, everybody goes and votes, right? Um, but I mean, even in the best cases of democracy, we don't really have 100% partaking. The third component is wide political understanding of how the political process works. Okay, so that everyone understands how we go process the questions and how we rule over things together, which is difficult to measure. The fourth component is the control of the political agenda by the people, that the people gets to pick what questions we actually talk about. And this is very, very difficult, because this is a very difficult, you know, thing to actually achieve in our representative democracies. Then we have the fifth, that when we say the people, we are as inclusive as we possibly can be, without, you know, lowering any of these other components. So usually that is that, you know, people who have a permanent stay in a country and have a certain age get to vote. So political equality, political understanding of the process, control of the agenda, partaking, and that the people is inclusive. All right, that's democracy. And Robert Dahl said, you know, so you have the spectrum, right? You can have something some more democratic organization and some less democratic organization. And he says that, you know, a state is just one type of organization. So what we do is we look at all of these components and we say, if all of them are better in one organization, then that organization is more democratic. But let's say if the people have a lot of understanding but less equality, and you compare it with something where they have more equality and less understanding, then suddenly you can't compare them anymore. So somehow, when we look at democratic models, we can only say that the ones that are better in all of these components, they are the more democratic ones. All right. So, you know, a quick history about democracy, right? In Athens, we had the first some of the first experiments with direct democracy, because, you know, farther back in time, in the caveman days, probably in the families, things were decided more democratically, and also, you know, within the tribes. But what happened was that with the introduction of agriculture and land, and also, you know, the written language, when information could be kept hidden in a much, you know, better way, and also just for a few amount of people who will actually understand these symbols, that's when they like we got a different type of power hierarchy where some people were less fortunate essentially. That's when the real inequality started growing, and where we started having less democratic institutions. So in Athens, they actually tried some direct democracy. They didn't really have a very inclusive definition of the people. It was just like the fortunate males, like they still had slaves and these things, right? Effective partaking by those people, and they had political equality for the people. And they understood it pretty well, and they could control the agenda. They could propose things to be on the agenda. And I mean, the thing is, it worked pretty well with trying to essentially get to reach their goals. Like, for example, if they wanted to get the best solution to build some road, for example, it worked pretty well. Later on, however, this model disappeared because we had the more powerful anti-democratic institutions taking over, and so forth. And it's been a lot like that through history, because we need to understand how power works to understand when democracy can happen. So, essentially, there is this theory called selectorate theory, and what it says is that in order for you to have power, you need to satisfy some key people, a key group. For example, in a dictatorship, this could be the dictator taking the money from the working people, giving it to the generals, giving it to the nobles, giving it to the priests. And in the system, as long as the key people to stay in power are satisfied, then it's going to be sustainable for the system to keep existing. The thing is that if a dictator tries to be good and tries to give more benefits to the people and let them keep their money, essentially what is going to happen is that they're going to be replaced. The military is going to let a coup happen, and getting the dictator replaced with one that will help the key people more. In a dictatorship, you always have a higher real tax than in a democracy, because in a dictatorship, the dictator forces the farmers to sell their product, for example, to a cheaper price within the country. Then they sell it for a higher price on the international market. So, in dictatorships, you often have these high taxes. It's usually not very good for the people. They're not doing very well with human rights and these things, right? But what happened with the industrialization, and when we started educating people more, like the people, the educated people made up a new means of production in this industrial society, and we got a middle class essentially. So now we had groups that were getting shares of the power, so that they would take part of the decisions, and that's when we got a democracy. Essentially, it's when we expanded the amount of key people necessary to be in power. And that is how the representative democracy was born, according to selectorate theory. And that's also why in democracies we have lower taxes and these things, because if you overtax the educated people, they're going to produce less. So it's like you want some kind of equilibrium where you have a high production, where they also can take these taxes and give it to the key groups. And that's also what the different political parties in representative democracies, they usually aim to provide something for these different groups. That's why they prioritize different questions. So essentially, we had this representative democracy for a long time. in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there were some authors writing about, social choice theory that, well, democracy is good because we have a lot of, these judges essentially. And let's say these judges were truly independent and had perfect information. The more judges, the better the judgment on whatever question. That's the Condorcet theorem of voting. And they also show that, in representative democracies, we don't really get to rank all of our votes. And like we like, for example, if you vote on someone to become the president, if you vote for someone to become the municipality leader, for example, you usually don't get to have a second vote, a vote for someone who you would like to give your vote to if your first alternative doesn't go through. And these things were kind of problematic, they thought, but they didn't really come up with a solution. And I mean, judges in the real world, they are kind of dependent and they don't really have perfect information. So in reality, we have judges, like the people deciding things are usually like dependent on each other, and they don't have all the information. So it's like, what if we could make up like some kind of decision-making system for them that would actually, give us the best possible judgment? And so some author wrote that maybe if we could vote directly in every question and propose questions, having control of the agenda, we could also delegate our votes, give it to someone in one or more questions. Those ideas started coming up in relation to social choice theory. But it wasn't before the 90s that this idea actually became realized with this delegation and also the ranking system. So in the 90s, there was a party in Sweden called the Telephone Party, started by Peter Alm. He was the creator of the Yellow Pages. It was a book with a lot of numbers to different people. And his idea was, okay, what if everyone votes on their phones in their homes on the various questions, in the parliament? What if everyone just sees the parliament on TV, and you can vote on your phones, like a true direct democracy on every question? And in this party was a young man called Mikael Nordfors, and he thought that this was not a very good system because in direct democracy, people don't have the time to go through questions. They don't have the energy. It's too much passing. The Swedish government passes 6,000 questions every year. And that's only the government. I mean, the parliament goes through way more than that. It's a more difficult number to calculate as well. And he realized by himself that we kind of want the experts to guide us in the various questions, and maybe we want to give our votes to experts that we count on being not corrupt, right? What if we could have technocracy, the experts leading the way, but at the same time making sure they're not corrupted? And that's when he came up with delegation as well, independently, and this ranking of the questions. And he realized we could do this on the internet. So he created the first party in the world using something he called interactive representative democracy, IRD. And essentially, this party was called the Direct Party. And they were pretty short-lived. They created this forum, but this forum they created was essentially a bunch of documents. Like they had documents they had to take care of. They didn't digitize anything yet. It was very cumbersome. And later on, Mikael is a very eccentric eccentric guy, and he had some problems with his medical career. So the direct party essentially failed, and they closed down. So he created a new one called Demo X together with some other people, and somewhere between here, there were some people from Britain that named this system liquid democracy, because they thought, well, in this system, we can get rid of these bad hierarchies. So it's like, you can't build a hierarchy with a liquid, right? Because the liquid would just fall back down again. And that's what we want. And that's why they named it liquid democracy. So the definition now of liquid democracy is usually then direct democracy with delegation and also the ability to rank your alternatives. So the direct democracy with delegation, and usually it's said that it only can work online, which all of these historical information also supports. In Demo X, then, they had this forum, which was open source, of course, because if the people can't actually confirm that the code they're using is the actual voting code, then it's really meaningless. And they actually were the first party using liquid democracy to get a position in Vallentuna municipality in Sweden. So this is the first party in the world trying this experiment. And it worked pretty well. But later on, they like their server had a big shutdown, and they lost interest.
Yeah.
The other
the
parties were essentially fighting this idea a lot, being populism and things like this.
Oh, you're on desktop.
Because
right
it was
now.
actually making up a real threat. So
I can see you in high definition.
essentially, what happened after that was that they also had a few issues with like hacking and security. So after that,
I was doing something real quick.
that party
Are you interested
shut down as well. Some of them created the Direct Democratic Party. Nothing really happened there for a very long time.
The new voting system.
But as our last talk was about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, blockchain, as you know, is something that can solve this problem of the hacking. It's something that can actually, we can actually make sure that if the system is in this decentralized system, where we can turn it back to its last state, if it would be altered, then we can actually have this, open source blockchain integrated liquid democracy, where everybody can take part in the questions they care about, which are going to be the questions, that are somehow part of their life. Because a normal worker in some company who works in agriculture, they're probably going to care a lot about the rights of agriculture workers. They're going to care about agricultural questions. Maybe they have an interest in computer science and they'll care about the digital politics. So in this kind of system, everybody will vote directly on what they care about. Then they get to delegate to someone they trust not to be corrupted in the other subject areas. And then, of course, this also made us ask a bunch of questions. It's like, how do you, for example, what do you do with the what do they call them? The FBI and the CIA, the secret services, essentially. What do you do with them? Well, in those cases, you can elect representatives, and the same thing. We don't really need the politicians anymore. We only need to elect the servants working in the various areas that need to carry out what the majority actually wants, because that's usually going to be the best thing. But then, of course, came the question of budget. This was a big question that were discussed a lot in the liquid democracy communities. How do you make a budget based on all of these various single questions? Well, the answer to that question came from Porto Alegre, where they showed that if you have a system like this, you let some economists go through all of the questions all the time, and they say, well, it's probably going to cost this much, and it's going to generate this money on this time span. You can calculate all of this, and you can create a mirror budget. So they had some economists creating a bunch of mirror budgets. Then the people get to vote on which one of those budgets they want. And that worked really well for them. They doubled the amount of schools, and they got running water to essentially everyone in their municipality. So this has been shown to work very well on the municipality level. It has never been tried on a national level. It has never been tried on a regional level between municipalities either. Or, of course, on a confederal or federal level in any number of questions. So that is, of course, an experiment. Even though we have indications it would probably work well for the internet age, we still don't know. But there is a very famous Swedish finance minister who is a big philosopher from the Social Democrats, who said this, that every decision we make and not make is a social experiment. So it's all, if we have an indication that something works, we should probably try it. We should try it and see. If it fails, then we'll go back to business as usual. But if it works, then that's amazing. We have a better system. And one more question raised is, of course, well, what about ideology then? What about, people have from different parties have these different ideologies. They want the whole of society to be different things. They want society to move towards a certain ideal. And the answer to that question is essentially, yes, but in liquid democracy, what is going to happen is that we're probably going to realize that people have the same values, but we prioritize different things based on where we are in society, based on the material, and based on the history of our lives, etc. And the result will probably be some kind of new ideology. We'll get a new path for our society to move forwards, which is something that is really necessary for our times, because we live in times, where a lot of things are changing, and the old ideologies can't really solve the problems that we have today. And that's why for the internet era, we need an internet solution. Yeah, that's pretty much liquid democracy and its history.
That was interesting. Very nice, thank you.
Yes, for sure.
Good performance.
Thank you.
So that's about the book you
Thank
have
you.
on you. That's the book.
Yes, this book, Democracy, was
nice.
written by me. It is
Ooh,
about
cool.
the history, and also how we also bring in some of our own ideology there, where we think that
Wow.
a lot of workers are doing wage slavery, and they aren't getting reduced labor times, and the only solution to these problems is democracy, a liquid democracy, and how in a vision for the future we could make our
Yeah.
schools more democratic, where you can choose what you want to read more freely. We can make all of the parts of society more, more to us better results, essentially. And then the only question for someone who is, working with liquid democracy is, how do you go about introducing liquid democracy? Because starting new parties has been very cumbersome, because the old system is very, it's very static, it's very resilient with change, and that's why, some people who